So hello everyone, I'm Meru Gokhale from Penguin Random House Publishers. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the opening night of Penguin Fever, a special edition of our immensely popular literary event, Spring Fever. Penguin Fever commemorates 30 years of publishing in India, and what better way than to be in the presence of books, authors, conversations, and discussions. Over the next few days, we have a programming across genres and interests, and we have a brilliant lineup in store for you. And of course, there's an open-air library which provides the perfect opportunity to be in the company of your favorite books. We have always received an overwhelming response to this festival. It is very close to our hearts, and it grows in popularity every year. We started this festival nearly 10 years ago, and we are the only publishers to celebrate readers, writers, and books on such a platform. I'd also like to thank the India Habitat Center for their support. They have been our partners from the very start, and they are wonderful co-hosts. We are also delighted that Arundhati Roy has chosen to make her first book appearance in the country at Penguin Fever. Like pretty much everyone else here, I can remember the first time that I read The God of Small Things. Its freshness, its difference, the effect that it had on Indian literature and publishing. Since then, Arundhati Roy has published a wide range of nonfiction, but I know that her readers were always hopeful somewhere that she might write another novel someday. So, when I had 5 missed calls from her literary agent, David Godwin, and a message asking me to have a secret meeting with him, I wondered. I had a feeling that this could be somehow Roy-related. So we met, and I realized that he had beside him a rather battered brown suitcase. And it contained the manuscript of Arundhati's new novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. I read it, and I immediately thought to myself, this is a novel which only Arundhati Roy could have written. It broke all the rules, and then it made new ones. And in fact, all her writing does this. She is not someone you can ever put in a box. And even if you tried, she isn't going to stay there for very long. Ministry has already sold nearly 500,000 copies worldwide. And after a long tour, here she is in her hometown, Delhi. But before we begin, please allow me to walk you through the evening. Arundhati will start with a reading from the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, followed by a conversation with Shohini Ghosh, who is a professor at the AJK Mass Communication Research Center. The conversation will be followed by audience questions, and we will finish with another short reading. Please do turn off your mobile phones, and let's begin the evening. And so without further ado, we bring you the one and the only Arundhati Roy.
Thank you. Is this an interrogation? Well, it's such a pleasure to be here at home, reading to you from a book which is about us and about here. I won't talk long now because you'll have 40 minutes of it. So I'll just start with the beginning of the book, and then we take it from there. The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, dedicated to the unconsoled. At magic hour, where the sun has gone but the light has not, armies of flying foxes unhinge themselves from the banyan trees in the old graveyard and drift across the city like smoke. When the bats leave, the crows come home, Not all the din of their homecoming fills the silence left by the sparrows that have gone missing and the old white-backed vultures, custodians of the dead for more than 100 million years that have been wiped out. The vultures died of diclofenac poisoning. Diclofenac, cow aspirin, given to cattle as a muscle relaxant to ease pain and increase the production of milk, worked like nerve gas on white-backed vultures. Each chemically relaxed, milk-producing cow or buffalo that died became poisoned vulture bait. As the cattle turned into better dairy machines, as the city ate more ice cream, butterscotch crunch, nutty buddy, and chocolate chip, as it drank more mango milkshake, vultures' necks began to droop as though they were tired and simply couldn't stay awake. Silver beards of saliva dripped from their beaks, and one by one they tumbled off their branches, dead. Not many noticed the passing of the friendly old birds. There was so much else to look forward to. The first chapter is called Where Do Old Birds Go to Die? She lived in the graveyard like a tree. At dawn she saw the crows off and welcomed the bats home. At dusk she did the opposite. Between shifts she conferred with the ghosts of vultures that loomed in her high branches. She felt the gentle grip of their talons like an ache in an amputated limb. She gathered they weren't altogether unhappy at having excused themselves and exited from the story. When she first moved in, she endured months of casual cruelty like a tree would, without flinching. She didn't turn to see which small boy had thrown a stone at her, didn't crane her neck to read the insults scratched into her bark. When people called her names, clown without a circus, queen without a palace, she let the hurt blow through her branches like a breeze and used the music of her rustling leaves as balm to ease the pain. It was only after Ziauddin, the blind imam who had once led the prayers in the Fatehpuri Masjid, befriended her and began to visit her, that the neighborhood decided it was time to leave her in peace. Long ago, a man who knew English told her that her name, written backwards in English, spelt Majnu. In the English version of the story of Layla and Majnu, he said, Majnu was called Romeo and Layla was Juliet. She found that hilarious. You mean I've made a khichdi of their story, she asked. What will they do when they find that Layla may actually be Majnu and Romy was really Julie? The next time he saw her, the man who knew English said he'd made a mistake. Her name spelled backwards would be Mujna, which wasn't a name and meant nothing at all. To this she said, it doesn't matter. I'm all of them. I'm Romy and Julie. I'm Layla and Majnu and Mujna. Why not? Who says my name is Anjum? I'm not Anjum. I'm Anjuman. I'm a mehfil. I'm a gathering of everybody and nobody, of everything and nothing. Is there anyone else you'd like to invite? Everyone's invited. The man who knew English said it was clever of her to come up with that one. He said he'd never have thought of it himself. She said, how could you have with your standard of Urdu? What do you think? English makes you clever automatically? He laughed. She laughed at his laugh. They shared a filter cigarette. He complained that Will's navy-cut cigarettes were short and stumpy and simply not worth the price. She said she preferred them any day to Foursquare or the very manly red and white. She didn't remember his name now. Perhaps she never knew it. He was long gone, the man who knew English, to wherever he had to go, and she was living in the graveyard behind the government hospital. For company, she had her steel Godrej Almira in which she kept her music, scratched records and tapes, an old harmonium, her clothes, jewelry, her father's poetry books, her photo albums, and a few press clippings that had survived the fire at the Khabgah. She hung the key around her neck on a black thread, along with her bent silver toothpick. She slept on a threadbare Persian carpet that she locked up in the day and unrolled between two graves at night, as a private joke, never the same two on consecutive nights. She still smoked, still navy cut. One morning, while she read the newspaper aloud to him, the old Imam, who clearly hadn't been listening, asked, affecting a casual air, "Is it true that even the Hindus among you are buried, not cremated?" Sensing trouble, she prevaricated. "True? Is what true? What is truth?" Unwilling to be deflected from his line of inquiry, the Imam muttered a mechanical response. "Sach Khuda hai, Khuda hi sach hai." Truth is God, God is truth, the sort of wisdom that was available on the backs of the painted trucks that roared down the highways. Then he narrowed his blind green eyes and asked in a sly green whisper, "Tell me, you people, when you die, where do they bury you? Who bathes the bodies? Who says the prayers?" Anjum said nothing for a long time. Then she leaned across and whispered back, untree-like, "Imam Sahib, when people speak of color, red, blue, orange, when they describe the sky at sunset or moonrise during Ramzan, what goes through your mind?" Having wounded each other thus deeply, almost mortally, the two sat quietly side by side on someone's sunny grave, hemorrhaging. Eventually, it was Anjum who broke the silence. "You tell me," she said. "You're the Imam Sahib, not me. Where do old birds go to die? Do they fall on us like stones from the sky? Do we stumble on their bodies in the streets? Do you not think that the all-seeing, almighty one who put us on this earth has made proper arrangements to take us away?" That day, the Imam's visit ended earlier than usual. Anjum watched him leave, tapping his way through the graves, his seeing eye cane making music as it encountered the empty booze bottles and discarded syringes that littered his path. She didn't stop him. She knew he'd be back. No matter how elaborate its charade, she recognized loneliness when she saw it. She sensed that in some strange, tangential way, he needed her shade as much as she needed his. And she had learned from experience that need was a warehouse that could accommodate a considerable amount of cruelty. Even though Anjum's departure from the Khabgah had been far from cordial, she knew that its dreams and its secrets were not hers alone to betray. Thank you. Thank you. Sit there.
Here today, indulging in my favorite pastime, which is to talk about the God of small things.
You mean the Ministry of Utmost Happiness?
The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. I'm terribly sorry. That is a Freudian slip. And maybe the story about that will emerge during the conversation. And I'm told that a lot of the people here in the hall today have actually read the book and come, which actually for you, Arundhati, is a bit of a new experience, wouldn't you say? That when you've been on a tour, many people did read it, but it was very early for the book. But
yeah, the first lot of traveling, it was early, and just now I've just come back from Europe, where, unfortunately for European publishers now, people start reading the English book, so, but yeah, still, I guess it's just out, right, the book.
And I'm told that in India itself, it has sold about 90,000 copies, which is a lot. And I'm delighted that people here have read the book. And so I don't need to describe it very much, because each one of us will have our own descriptions of it. The way I look at the book, I see it as a kind of a scopious, sprawling landscape of vibrant characters, dynamic characters, moving across different kinds of locations. The narrative moves through a number of places, and in each space you have these ensemble of characters. Some of them, stay through the novel, others come and go, and some of them come and stay. And apart from the major characters that all of you are familiar with, and right now you introduce everybody to Anjum, and then there are, other characters like Tilo and Musa and Naga, and these are just the human characters. There's a whole range of animals and bugs and mammals and birds, and they come and they go, and some of them come and they stay. The question that I want to begin with, Arundhati, is something that you must have been asked, but I still must ask that, and that is, you have been, over the last 20 years, extremely prolific in writing non-fiction, and that writing has been bookended by 2 works of fiction, God of Small Things and Ministry of Utmost Happiness. And they are separated by 20 years. Why 20 years?
Well, of course I've been asked that many times, and I think when I answer it in other places and when I answer it here, what I say will be seen in a much deeper way here. But basically, after I finished The God of Small Things, and what happened with it, and the way it sort of just blew my life apart in so many ways, in good ways and bad ways and all that. I used to wonder whether I would ever regret having written a book that, did, in crass terms, was so successful. But it just, around the same time, was, of course, the time of the nuclear tests, and, I was somehow part of the sort of marketing of this international brand, and I really wasn't up for that. And when the nuclear tests happened, I felt that I didn't have the choice of keeping quiet, because whether I spoke or didn't speak, it was equally political. And I wrote The End of Imagination, which led me on a journey into worlds which really expanded my understanding of things. And as I traveled through, I wrote to explain things to myself as well as to readers. And those journeys and that writing sort of layered in me, and I felt something like a sedimentary rock, and there was much of what I was learning that was accumulating in me separate from the non-fiction argument. And that, at some point, reaches a critical mass, and I start to write The Ministry of Utmost Happiness.
The curious thing is that, once you've written a novel that has been incredibly successful, the temptation is always to kind of try to reproduce that form. In The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, you actually completely move away from that kind of form. As I said, that I like to describe it as a sprawling landscape, but it's also like a teeming metropolis of people, places, ideas, things, In fact, if I can just read a little bit from one of the later chapters, when one of the characters, Khadija, is taking Tilo across the city in Kashmir. And they travel, and I quote, through a maze of narrow, winding streets in a part of a town that seemed to be interconnected in several ways, underground and overground, vertically and diagonally, via streets and rooftops and secret passages like a single organism, a giant coral or an anthill. Now, this could well be, in my opinion, a description of the structure of the the Ministry of Utmost Happiness. This is what happens when you catch up late with the book. My question is that doing something like this, which has a completely different literary aspiration, is also a huge risk. And why did you want to take that risk?
Well, one of the great risks of success and fame in the arts is that you could become domesticated, or you could domesticate yourself by wanting to replicate or sort of play in or reward people's expectations of that I would write the son of the god of small things, or god of small things too. And for me, even when I wrote it, I was very clear that I was not setting out to become a professional novelist, that I would not just keep writing books. I would write a novel when I had the novel to write. So of course, after The God of Small Things, I had the option of signing up, for a huge advance, and having people manage me and sort of overtly or covertly tell me what to do, which I didn't want. And when I started writing The Ministry, I had the choice of being utterly experimental, and because I didn't do that, and yet there are things which, though they are very apparently different, The God of Small Things is a book, as I see it, a book about a broken family with a broken heart at its center. And in some ways, The Ministry sort of inverts that. And it's a book about people who start out broken, people who have shards of broken hearts, and they somehow bring them together in a graveyard and make a put together mended heart, But in terms of how, the games with trying to structure a novel or how you tell a story, to me, that's fundamental. To me, structuring a novel is the deepest joy that I have. Language is of course the construction material, but so I did want to experiment for myself. Obviously, if I was the kind of person who wanted to deliver on expectation, I wouldn't have written a single one of my political essays.
Yes, I think that's kind of fairly known and accepted about you. And now my question is actually going to be about God of Small Things, so it's not a slip.
We don't believe you.
You better. So, well, yes, it is a very, very different novel from The God of Small Things. But, the chapter that you just read out, where do old birds go to die? That's a line taken from The God of Small Things. And when you do read the books together, there are resonances, And I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about that. There must be some connection somewhere, isn't there?
Well, the question of where do old birds go to die is a question that Sophie Mole, a little girl in The God of Small Things, asks. And that sentence grew wings and flew into the Ministry of Utmost Happiness. But there are some connections which were deliberate, and then there are some connections which were not, and which I suddenly, right these days I'm working with the Urdu translation with the person who's translating it, and we read, and suddenly something flies up at me, and I say, oh. And there are some naughty little references for no reason but naughtiness. But the main connection between the two books is the character of Tilottama, because she is, to me, in my mind, she's the daughter of Ammu and Velita, had the god of small things ended differently. So she's the younger sibling of Esteban and Rahel. And Esteban and Rahel do have rooms of their own in the Jannat guest house. But there are other kinds of connections which, for example, there's a long chapter in The God of Small Things that's set in a cinema hall. And a cinema hall plays a very major part in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness in a very, very, very different way, And there are, of course, the cement kangaroos hopped across into the ministry, but those are just like slightly naughty connections. But then there's obviously political connections, For example, the God of Small Things, though people, and I would say particularly people in Kerala initially tried to kind of elide the heart of the book, which is a very political heart, the God of Small Things, although, the practice of caste by this Syrian Christian family, the tragedy of transgression when Ammu and Velita come together. In Kerala, when the book came out, 5 lawyers got together and filed the last chapter in court and said, this book is corrupting public morality. Now, that politics comes into the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, of course, again in a totally different way. But Tilottama brings it in with her. But there are other characters too who carry that politics in. But so there are other things which I didn't realize. For example, suddenly I realized that there's a similarity in towards the end of The God of Small Things. You have this boat full of touchable policemen going down the Meenachal River. And in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, you have a boat full of army officers going down, and that sense of dread. And of course, not least of all, both books end with with insects with personalities, Yeah, The God of Small Things has Chaputambaran, and the Ministry of Utmost Happiness has Guikyum, the dung beetle.
Just, going back to the Jannat guest house, which is now full of people who are...
We're just assuming, of course, everyone knows what that is. We are assuming
that everybody has read it. The Jannat guest house in this graveyard, the place that Anjum creates, the Anjum about whom you read, has created this, this out of desolation, this place that, houses all kinds of social, sexual, and political dissidents. And it's a diverse cast of characters. Do they have something in common? How did they come into your imagination when you were thinking of writing the book? A question. Are they around?
They're here. Okay. Can't you see them?
I better be careful about what I say.
They're always around.
Yeah, that's why.
They moved in and they're not moving out. They're not going anywhere. But how do they come? To be honest, the truthful answer is that I don't know. And the truthful thing for me to say would be that when I'm writing fiction, I'm absolutely unable to talk about it. And even after now, it's been a while since I finished, so I'm able to sound as if all this was planned. But in some ways, it's a process which is. Sometimes I've spoken about this as very much like city planning. Where you make a plan, it gets ambushed, you replan it, there's a migration, and there are unauthorized colonies, there are all kinds of people who show up, and your plans are ambushed, and then you replan it, and yet it's never a city always inscribes itself on the surface of the earth against the organic contours of nature. So it's always got a form, and so when you say sprawling, or when you, truthfully, it's not a television series, because it's got a form that keeps circling in on itself. And obviously, when I started writing it, it isn't, even though Anjum starts the book, she was not the first person that I wrote about. She came knocking on the door much later. But the characters, you asked me, do they have something in common? Again, I wouldn't have known this while I was writing it, but course. Now I know.
When you look back on it.
I know that all of them have borders running through them of some kind. Anjum has the border of gender running through her. Tilotoma has the border of caste running through her. One of the characters is called Saddam Hussein, and he is a young Dalit man who, when he is a boy, actually watches his father being beaten to death by a mob of people in 2002, and then he converts and becomes a Muslim and calls himself Saddam Hussein. And he has that border of conversion running through him. But then you have other characters like Musa, Tilotoma's friend Musa, who's a Kashmiri, who has obviously a national border running through him. You have a character like Garson Hobart, who's, in some ways the most strange person in the book.
We will talk about him.
He also has a border running through him, So in some ways, all of us, we know that far from what the West thinks of India as an anarchic, bumbling, crazy society, actually it's a society that lives by the grid, and where not even a grid, it's a wire mesh, and everyone lives in their little given spaces. And then these characters are, it's not that they are dissidents really or dropouts, they are off-grid by birth or by who they are in some ways, where they belong geographically and socially. And so through their off-gridness, they illuminate the grid in some ways. But that sounds very clever. Huh? That I just made up later.
We realized it when you were writing it. But, now that you have been touring and talking about the book, that, you must be also kind of, it's appearing to you in interesting sort of ways, I'm sure. Since you're talking about the characters, I was wondering whether you would also tell us about all the non-human protagonists, that the book is filled with, Biru the dog, Agha and Khanam the cats, Zainab's goat that survives 16 Bakri Eids, Sultan the rooster who doesn't survive the military occupation in Kashmir. How do you see this world? It's really rare to find so many creatures in a novel, because usually novels are either about animals or they're about people, or they're about animals who are pets. But in this book, they are characters, and they have little biographies, and they have a mind of their own.
Well, I think, I grew up in this village in Imanam as a child in a place where there was nothing. There were no shops, restaurants, nothing. My playground was the river bank, and I knew every creature, every plant, every fish, everything. And so I think I've always been that person who doesn't just, whose world doesn't just consist of human beings. It never has been that, and of course, one of the joys of writing fiction for me is the joy of being able to describe landscape. The God of Small Things, to me, before I wrote it, I was a screenplay writer, and if it was a screenplay, I would have had to say exterior day, river. but to be able to just evoke that river, And for me, similarly here, to be able to describe the landscape of the city, or the valley of Kashmir, or the desolateness outside of Delhi, and always what I love, and what also obviously it tears you up, truly. I mean, even when you think about the descriptions of war and so on, bombing of Afghanistan or Syria, and everyone just counts the human beings, and you just imagine everything else that was incinerated and destroyed and doesn't even deserve a mention. And Anjum and Saddam especially. Saddam is a character who rides through the town on this horse that is his business. She's his business partner. And he's a guy who just has a radar for animals. He's always picking up creatures or rescuing them, and they have a life. So the border between humans and animals, between the living and the dead, is also sort of blurred in that graveyard and in the Jannat guest house.
You mentioned, you're writing screenplays, and you've written 2 screenplays for In Which Annie Gives It Those Ones and Electric Moon. And my question to you is that, did that shape you in some ways as a writer?
Yeah, well, I'm sure it did, in the sense that, those were amongst the earliest things I wrote, and it was a kind of discipline. When you're writing screenplays, you learn economy, because every little extra scene costs a lot to shoot. So you learn economy, and you learn to write dialogue. So I think those 2 things, it surely did teach me,
And what about your training as an architect and an urban planner? Arundhati actually studied architecture, wrote a dissertation on urban planning, and topped her batch. And did that in some ways kind of help you in thinking about structures, for instance?
No, for me, the only reason to study architecture is to write a novel. It's a fundamental influence on the way I work.
No, but when you studied architecture, did you know you were going to write a novel? Did you have aspirations?
When I studied architecture, my only aspiration was how to make it to the end of the week, because I had left home and I had no money and I had no aspirations except those of survival. But somewhere today, it's a great influence on me. I guess structuring it, but also, through the years of writing the things I have written, even in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, there are moments which are part or echo my
dissertation,
my thesis in the School of Architecture, and thinking about the city was very much part of what I began to do when I was in my last few years there. Yeah, so it's a tremendous influence.
Has it found its way into the novel?
Yeah, it has. It has. That's what I was telling you.
And do you want to tell us exactly where? Or?
No, one of the things that, when I was in 5th year, my thesis was called Post-Colonial Urban Development in Delhi and what the city does to its people. And one of the things was about how the institutions of the city are designed in ways to exclude its poorest citizens. And I talked about the city and the non-city, the citizen and the non-citizen, how people are expected to live in the cracks between those institutions. I had to actually defend it to a jury, and I said, the poor, even the sewage system doesn't belong to them, and they have to shit on top of the sewage system. And so, there's a moment in the book where that thought comes up. Let me just see if I can find it.
Could it be this? Can I find it for you?
You already marked it.
Yes. So I kind of subtly manipulating you to do
Okay.
to follow
Sure.
my wishes.
Can I see? Wasn't even that subtle, Shohini. This is a description of Tilotama early in the morning, looking out of her little Barsati, waiting for Saddam Hussein to come and pick her up along with this baby that she's kidnapped from Jantar Mantar. And while she looks out, I'll just read it from the beginning. It says, pre-dawn, still no sign of Saddam Hussein. The kidnapper looked down from her window a little impatiently. A text message on her phone. Let us unite on International Yoga Day for poolside candlelight yoga and meditation by Guru Hanumant Bharadwaj. She tapped out a reply, please let's not. Right beside the school gate on which a painted nurse was giving a painted baby a painted polio vaccination, a circle of sleepy women, migrant workers from roadworks nearby, stood around a tiny boy as he squatted like a comma on the edge of an open manhole. The women leaned on their shovels and pickaxes as they waited for their star to perform. The comma had his eyes fixed on one of the women, his mother. The spirit moved him. He made a pool, a yellow leaf. His mother put down her axe and washed his bottom with muddy water from an old Bisleri bottle. With the leftover water, she washed her hands and washed the yellow leaf into the manhole. Nothing in the city belonged to the women, not a tiny plot of land, not a hovel in a slum, not a tin sheet over their heads, not even the sewage system. But now they had made a direct, unorthodox deposit, an express delivery straight into the system. Maybe it marked the beginning of a foothold in the city. The comma's mother gathered him up in her arms, slung her axe across her shoulder, and the little contingent left. The street was empty.
Thank you. Thanks so much. You know, this is also very typical of the book, these absolutely wonderful, illuminating vignettes, which to my mind are actually quite cinematic. But you don't seem to be very keen that your books be made into films, and I was wondering whether you would like to talk about that.
Well, I have quite a funny story about that. When The God of Small Things was published, obviously, like I mentioned earlier, when I wrote The God of Small Things, somewhere in my mind, I set out to write what I called a stubbornly visual but unfilmable book. Mm-hmm. So there was a sort of, it is very visual, but I actually don't think it would make a great film, reduced to verbs and adjectives and stuff. But when I was in Los Angeles, there were a lot of Hollywood filmmakers who would try to buy the rights. So my agent, David Godwin, at some point, he keeps saying, so-and-so wants it, so-and-so wants it, and I wouldn't reply. So he says, look, Arundhati, they're willing to give you anything they want. What do you want? So I said, I want them to grovel, and then I want to say no. So he's like, oh, all right then, okay.
So that was the end.
That was the end.
When you were reading it out, it's pretty evident to everybody and to those who have read it that it's a book that is extremely, eminently readable. And a great diversity of people have actually read the book. But it's also, in some ways, a challenging read. And, one of the people who reviewed it said that it requires a kind of readerly perseverance. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think that, I said that it was I looked at it as a city, but truthfully, probably it's an underwater city. So you could choose whether you wanted to swim with the fish on the surface and then take a little dive and swim with the fish in the middle and then go deep down and swim with the bottom feeders, you know. It's a book which I didn't want to, I mean, for me, you know, something that you can just read and have read isn't much fun. Because even when I read it, find things, you know, like some woman who's hidden money in various pockets of her clothes and suddenly discovers bits and things. And to me, it's not baby food, but it also can be if you want it to be. But that's what I meant when I said I wanted to take a risk. That I had written that book, that big commercial bestseller. Not that I ever thought The God of Small Things was going to be that, but it became that. So I'm very interested in how can you take something like a novel and make it do what only a novel can do. What is that art form? We can push it to its limits, you know? It's not a novel that wants to be an essay. It's not a novel that wants to be a film. It's a novel that wants to be a novel. And how can you also, you know, I mean, I do feel sometimes that even the big commerce around literature, I mean, you go to the Frankfurt Book Fair and part of you feels relieved that there is commerce around literature. It's booming, great. But sometimes the speed at which it happens, it has to be categorized. You have to tell them in 3 sentences and 6 adjectives, and which shelf is it going to be in, as if it has to have a heading or a subheading or a subject. Is it a love story? Is it a history book? Is it a political book? And I'm saying no. I'm not going to be able. I want to write something, but I can't describe. You know, I want to write something which is about the air we breathe. And the air we breathe has caste and gender and Kashmir and love and animals and cities and jokes and everything, you know. Can we just write about what we breathe in and breathe out? Can we write where we're not afraid of intimacy? We're not afraid of politics. We're not afraid when the background becomes the foreground. We're not afraid of writing because, you know, people are scared of writing often I'm asked, you know, are you a writer or an activist? Because you're not supposed to write about political stuff and be a writer. But I want to say, come on, you know, we live in places where politics kicks the door in at 3 a.m. Can you write a book where it's not just a few characters with a political backdrop, but you don't walk past anyone. The guard who's guarding the Honda City ad outside the public toilet is not just a guard. Can you just stop and smoke a cigarette with him and ask him where he's come from? You know, everybody, there's that sense in which that is how we live. And it is overwhelming sometimes. But eventually you get lost and you figure it out, you know.
And it's a book that also invites revisitations, and having read it more than once, I discover new things each time, and how interestingly the chapters, they're almost like, the mystery deepens or the mystery unfolds. You get to know new things as you move across the chapters. But there's one question that I've been wanting to ask you, and that is, to my mind, one of the most audacious literary tropes in the book is to give the authorial voice to a character called Garson Hobart, who 30 pages down the chapter, in the chapter titled Landlord, we realize that his name is Biplab Dasgupta. No.
Yes.
Okay. I thought I'd made a mistake. Biplab Dasgupta, who is an intelligence agent, but he is in a kind of a crisis. He's been sent on leave to fix his drinking problem, and because of that, his professional and personal life is in crisis. And this character known as Garson Hobart because he was going to act in a play in college in which his name was going to be Garson Hobart. And a very unlikely person, but he is the person who plays a very major role in introducing some of the most important characters. My question is that why did you decide to give him the privilege of the authorial voice? And two, why is he such a shambling wreck when we meet him?
Ask him. I mean, you know, he shocked me when he appeared and started to speak in the first person. I said, listen, you know, he's the sort of rule of law type of guy who's breaking all the rules of literary fiction, like appearing and starting to speak in first person in the middle of the novel. But he did, and he insisted on doing that. And I tried to thwart that, but it didn't work. And then I tried to figure out, I mean, I still try to figure out why, you know, why was that happening? And I mean, again, you know, I can come up with an explanation. It may not be the right one. Just because I wrote it doesn't mean I have all the answers. But to me, in some ways, Garson Hobart is also like a trans person, you know. Half of him is the voice of the state, but not the state of today, the somewhat rabid and less intelligent state of today, but the sort of secular, upper caste, Brahmanical, secular Nehruvian state of the days gone by. Half of him is that, and half of him is this shambling wreck. So he appears in this way, and maybe that voice of the state somehow that seems to want to have the authority to speak for all of us, you know. So I actually want to read a little. He's a guy who, unlike the other characters, he may actually see he actually, when he's in college, watches a horrible murder on the streets of Delhi in 1984 during the Sikh killings, and he doesn't react in a human way, you know. He reacts like the state, even before he's become the state, because he puts it into perspective. He has a historical take on it. And I'll just read, it's just a paragraph, but he says, I saw a mob lynch an old Sikh gentleman. They pulled off his turban, tore out his beard, and necklaced him, South Africa style, with a burning tire, while people stood around, baying their encouragement. I hurried home and waited for the shock of what I had witnessed to hit me. Oddly, it never did. The only shock I felt was shock at my own equanimity. I was disgusted by the stupidity, the futility of it all, but somehow I was not shocked. It could be that my familiarity with the gory history of the city I had grown up in had something to do with it. It was as though the apparition, whose presence we in India are all constantly and acutely aware of, had suddenly surfaced, snarling from the deep, and had behaved exactly as we expected it to. Once its appetite was sated, it sank back into its subterranean lair, and normality closed over it. Maddened killers retracted their fangs and returned to their daily chores. Normality in our part of the world is a bit like a boiled egg. Its humdrum surface conceals at its heart a yolk of egregious violence. It is our constant anxiety about that violence, our memory of its past labors, and our dread of its future manifestations that lays down the rules for how a people as complex and as diverse as we are continue to coexist, continue to live together, tolerate each other, and from time to time murder one another. As long as the center holds, as long as the yoke doesn't run, we'll be fine. In moments of crisis, it helps to take the long view. So this is him, very cold-blooded, and he's pretty cold-blooded about himself and his own failings and all of that as well.
That is why I think.
But for me, it was interesting because he appeared, and I didn't want to create easy meat, like somebody who you can just mock. And he's a character who has a point of view, and you have to take him seriously. And his point of view certainly isn't mine. So while I was writing with his voice in my head, I was, I knew I was walking the edge of sanity.
And I think that, he is one of the most intriguing characters, and somebody who we could have been or who could be our friend. And
I couldn't have been, which is why it was kind of scary to write him.
Yes, but, it is what makes the book very rich. But, Garson Hobart just came in there and said that there's time only for one question.
Garson. So he's the rule maker.
I'm just going to, end with asking you to talk a little bit about the 3 lines that have become, most quoted from the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, not the God of Small Things. And that is how to tell a shattered story by slowly becoming everybody. No, by slowly becoming everything. What did you mean by that?
Well, again, I didn't write those lines.
Silo did. Yeah, that she just told me that.
There are a few lines that Musa sees scrawled in Tilottama's notebook. And I think she has this little collection which she calls the Reader's Digest book of grammar and English comprehension for very young children, in which she writes a whole series of stories about Kashmir and her travels there. And I think perhaps what she has her finger on is the process of what is the difference between an argument and a political essay and actually writing fiction. That you have to allow things, you have to become things, and you may not succeed, you may fail, but you must always try. You must always try to become everything. And she being a person who is just constructed in a way where she cannot just accept belonging to some country and waving a flag and standing up and saluting everyone every time someone asks her to. The struggle of being open and yet having a place of dignity to make up her own mind about things is open to becoming everything, to becoming everyone. And then she's also very, very much herself, who lives
in the country of her own skin.
In the country of her skin, a country that issues no visas and has no consulates. But yeah, that's her.
Thank you, Arundhati, very much. I think it's time for us to probably take questions. And yes, Meru, you're here to
is the mic on?
Orchestrate this
yes,
session.
Yes, I am. And thank you, Arundhati and Shohini, for such a thoughtful conversation. Let's please first give them a huge round of applause.
Thank you.
Can you have this light off? So we have 15 minutes for questions, so let's make them meaningful. I want to start by asking, we've got some questions from the hundreds of people who are waiting outside. So since they haven't got a seat here, I thought it might be quite nice to start with them.
Okay.
Do you have a message for everybody outside? They have a video screen where they can see you.
Hey, hello everybody. I'm coming there.
Okay, so there is Saqib Hussain from the people sitting outside. His question is, who is your favorite English writer and Urdu poet?
So I'm not a hierarchical thinker.
He's sitting outside.
Not a hierarchical thinker, so I don't have that bestseller list. But I can tell him sometime the poets as well as the the writers whom I love. But of course, many of my favorite Urdu poets are in this book, so he can read them there.
Thank you. Okay, who would like to ask the first question? That lady over there, can you get her a mic, please? Could you start by introducing yourself, and if we can stick to questions rather than statements? Well, it's actually her, but
you can ask.
The mic is already there.
She can ask the second one.
Would you like to stand up and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Faryal. And I wanted to ask that how and why did Kashmir become part of the Ministry of Utmost Happiness?
How and why did Kashmir become a part of the ministry? Well, because I think Kashmir is fundamental to what our lives are today. And I'm not just talking about the fact that we have a place where there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers administering civilian life. But I'm not talking only about what does that do to people in Kashmir, but what does that do to people in India? You know, how do we as a people give ourselves the right to speak about all the various forms of violence and injustice perpetrated on us, if you're willing to swallow it when it comes to someone else. So to me, it's a fundamental moral problem that we have to deal with, and to not deal with issues like Kashmir, to not deal with issues like caste, which many, many writers manage to do. To me, it's like a writer in South Africa writing about South Africa at the time of apartheid without mentioning there was apartheid, you know.
Thank you.
Who's next? Lady over here.
Hello, I am Tarana, and I am also a writer with Juggernaut. So my question is that there are so many issues that you have put forth, like little brush strokes of this and that. And then there are these beautifully etched characters. So did you plan out the whole structure and the issues that you would put forth, or did you begin with the character, the main characters, and you had the picture in your mind?
Well, you know, the first thing I must say is that I never think of things as issues. You know, it's a very impersonal thing, you know, that you're picking up issues and it's not, to me, it's a way of seeing, it's a way of looking at the world. And I keep saying, I write about the air we breathe, and the air is full of this. These are not issues. This is us. This is us. We cannot ever think of ourselves as external to all that is going on. But about how I write, you know, it took me about 10 years to write this book. So basically what happened is that I mean, like I said, these things that began to build up with me as I traveled, as I thought, as I wrote. But the first thing I actually wrote in the book is not what appears first in the book, but the nerve center of the Ministry of Utmost Happiness is Jantar Mantar, and which is sadly being shut down, and I don't think we should let that happen, but that's separate. But so I actually was there one night. I used to go there very often, and a baby, an abandoned baby, suddenly appeared amongst all these people's movements and resistance movements, and nobody knew what to do with it. And it made me think, even I didn't know, of course, what to do. And it made me think a lot about the wisdom and the politics and the energy, and then suddenly this confusion and call the police. And so that was the first moment when the fiction started to happen. But, you know, for example, through the many years I've been to Kashmir, and one of the first things I started doing was to write down the Kashmiri English alphabet. You see a place that has been brutalized like that develop its own language, and then it's a question. I mean, the early years of the book were like generating smoke, and the later years were like sculpting it. So it involves a tremendous amount of discipline, a tremendous amount of work to make it look light.
We'll come back down here, but let's try and get a question in from the balcony. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ganesh. I'm from BBC. My question is about, as far as your writings, please correct me if I'm wrong. When I read your writings, especially essays, you focused on the northern India mostly, not on the southern India. So could you explain about these things? Thank you.
Well, that's true because my book, The God of Small Things, was set in southern India, So I don't feel like I have to be a sort of national representative equally distributed in regions or anything, So, yeah.
The gentleman over here. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Shuddha. I've been living with this book for a while and living in this city for longer. I don't have a question, I have a proposition, and it's not just for you, it's for everyone over here. And it has to do with the nerve center of the book, which is Jantar Mantar, and it has to do with the nerve center in some ways of all our lives, of this large part of this territory, which is also Jantar Mantar. Since it is now a forbidden space, I just have a brief idea that it might be an interesting move to initiate mass readings of this book in Jantar Mantar. There are lots of young people here. It's because if Dr. Azad Bhartiya does not write his manifesto, if Miss Mehjabeen II is not born, I think the birds will really go home to die.
Yeah.
So the weather is going to turn nicer. So there are lots of young people just take copies of the book. And like in Gezi Park in Istanbul, where there was a very major civic opposition movement that started because people started standing, sitting, and reading books. No one can stop you from reading a book in Jantar Mantar. It can become a most beautiful mass movement in Delhi.
Thank you.
In this book.
Can we have a mic over there to the lady sitting over there? Please stand up so that... Yes, you. Her, actually.
My name is Fennu. I'm from Madagascar. I'm really happy to be here. It's my first time in New Delhi. And my question is, how did you decide on the title? You had the God of small things. Now the ministry. Why the ministry? And of utmost. And then how... what reading should we have if we are not, we don't really know India, and we want to really relate into the story?
The Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Well, the ministry of utmost happiness surely has something to do with God. And the ministry is, you can read it as in fact, in other languages, the ministry does not have the connotations of a religious ministry as it does in English. So, in the translations, it loses that other meaning, But to me, the ministry of utmost happiness is about people who find ways, temporary ways, very slender ways, very unusual ways of recognizing and celebrating happiness in the most unexpected place. Not an abandoned, but a little used graveyard. Anjum starts the Anjum starts the Jannat guest house in a graveyard, encircling the graves of her own relatives, stealing electricity from the morgue where the corpses of the city's vagrants lie in air-conditioned splendor that they've never known in their real lives. And gradually it becomes a place where, to me, I think one of the greatest gifts a human being can have is the ability to recognize happiness, genuinely, And somehow they have their moments. They go through terrible things. And the reason that they can never be defeated is that they've already been broken, and yet they know how to be happy. And they know that happiness is not really an institution, But so that's the title. A lot of people think it's sarcastic, but it's not, actually. As for your question about readers who are not Indian, this book is not, like Shohini said, it's about human beings and animals, and you don't have to be an Indian. It's already been translated in 40 languages, and the other day a Polish journalist interviewed me, and he says, Madam Roy, you wrote the Ministry of Utmost Happiness about India, but when I read about Poland, So it's not. I would never consider that I'd write a book which isn't accessible to any human being who's open to being accessed,
So we have time for 3 more questions. There's a gentleman over here who's been raising his hand. Please introduce yourself.
I am Rajarshi Day. While reading your second work of fiction, I felt it was a collection of stories. Is it meant to be that? In particular, when I was reading The Untimely Death of Miss Jabin, I was struck by your special ability to even make a virtue of death when you describe death as another way of living, which for me was a very inspiring statement. And then you described the bullet which pierced Jabin's head near the ear, and you said it appeared as if a rose had been placed over her ear. These 2 sentences I really liked very much. I want to know whether Miss Jabin's story is based on fiction, or is it based on some character that you have seen or met?
The thing about writing fiction, somehow people always make this binary about, is it fiction or is it true? And I have a T-shirt which says, fiction is truth, And truly, to me, there isn't that binary, And the only way that the Ministry of Utmost Happiness can have weight is that it draws its sustenance. It has deep tap roots, and it's like when you make a rag, you have to know the notes. So surely those notes are notes that I know, and notes that are true, but not any one of the characters is exactly this one or that one or that one. And yet, together they echo. The chapter of Miss Jabin actually begins with a quote from James Baldwin, which I love, which he says, and they would not believe me precisely because they knew that what I was saying would be true.
The young lady in the balcony.
Good evening, ma'am. I'm Shohini Mukhopadhyay, and I've been a literature student myself. I'm studying mass communication right now, and I completely agree to what you said, that literature or any piece of writing cannot be a part of, watertight bookshelves. So I wanted to know your opinions about, do you think there is something like a pure truth, or there's a difference between pure truth and political truth? Do you think pure truth exists at all?
I think in terms of music, you either hit the right note or you're off key. It has nothing to do with purity and politics, especially when you write fiction. And especially these days, when you're looking at a situation where facts are made up, there's fake news, somehow increasingly I believe that fiction is truth. And maybe I should say good fiction is truth,
So I think we have time for one final question. So who has the most burning question after this? Please be prepared. The lady over here, you've been raising your hand for a while.
Oh dear, I'm really sorry if this question
No pressure.
isn't worthy of the last question, but I just wanted to follow on from your response to this lady over here. Obviously, I'm not an Indian, but I related to all the characters in the book, and I absolutely love the book. But I was really interested in what that gentleman had to say about how this might be a book to be read as almost kind of a sign of protest, which made me sort of think about how when I was reading it, I was very curious about who you wrote the book for. Obviously, you wrote it for everyone, but specifically, who did you really want to read this book?
You know, I have been asked that question very often. And the truth is that I write, I mean, when I write nonfiction, all nonfiction, I'm not talking about my nonfiction essays, they've always been very urgent interventions, arguments in a situation that's closing down. For me, a novel is a universe that I construct for somebody that I love to walk through, you know? And anybody can walk through who wants to. Anybody who's not frightened of it can walk through. They might get lost, they may find their way, they may not like what they see, that doesn't matter, but I just never write something for a particular kind of person, never. You know, to me, these characters, Anjum and Saddam and Musa and Tilotma, they're stubborn bastards, you know. They just have their own way, and they don't ever kind of try and make you, they don't try to accommodate people. They just have, they're very careful about how they like to be. And so it's a universe through which anybody can walk, you know. It's not an argument. It's not even a protest necessarily. It's a way of looking at the world.
Thank you. Arundhati, would you like to now read from the book? We're about to close this event, and before Arundhati starts reading, let's give her and Shohini another round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience. You've been an amazing audience.
It's a very wonderful thing for me to read this, to live in Delhi, to write this book in Delhi. And I know it's a city that we like to give galis to, but you know, sometimes I'm even fond of the pollution. So since somebody brought it up, I'm going to read The Untimely Death of Miss Jabin. Ever since she was old enough to insist, she had insisted on being called Miss Jabin. It was the only name she would answer to. Everyone had to call her that. Her parents, her grandparents, the neighbors too. She was a precocious devotee of the Miss fetish that gripped the Kashmir Valley in the early years of the insurrection. All of a sudden, fashionable young ladies, especially in the towns, insisted on being addressed as Miss. Miss Momin, Miss Ghazala, Miss Farhana. It was only one of the many fetishes of the times. In those blood-dimmed years, for reasons nobody fully understood, people became what can only be described as fetish-prone. Other than the Miss fetish, there was a nurse fetish, a PT instructor fetish, and a roller skating fetish. So in addition to checkposts, bunkers, weapons, grenades, landmines, Cassipiers, concertina wire, soldiers, insurgents, counterinsurgents, spies, special operatives, double agents, triple agents, and suitcases of cash from the agencies on both sides of the border. The valley was also awash with nurses, PT instructors, and roller skaters. And of course, Mrs. Among them, Miss Jabin, who didn't live long enough to become a nurse nor even a roller skater. In the Mazar-e-Shuhada, the martyr's graveyard where she was first buried, the cast iron signboard that arched over the main gate said in 2 languages, "We gave our todays for your tomorrows." It's corroded now, the green paint faded, the delicate calligraphy flecked with pinholes of light. Still, there it is after all those years, silhouetted like a swatch of stiff lace against the sapphire sky and the snowy, saw-toothed mountains. There it still is. Miss Jabin was not a member of the committee that decided what should be written on the signboard, but she was in no position to argue with its decision. Also, Miss Jabin hadn't notched up very many todays to trade in for tomorrows. But then the algebra of infinite justice was never so rude. In this way, without being consulted on the matter, she became one of the movement's youngest martyrs. She was buried right next to her mother, Begum Arifa Yeswi. Mother and daughter died by the same bullet. It entered Miss Jabin's head through her left temple and came to rest in her mother's heart. In the last photograph of her, the bullet wound looked like a cheerful summer rose arranged just above her left ear. A few petals had fallen on her coffin, the white shroud she was wrapped in before she was laid to rest. Miss Jabin and her mother were buried along with 15 others, taking the toll of their massacre to 17. At the time of their funeral, the Mazar-e-Shuhada was still fairly new, but was already getting crowded. However, the Intizamiya committee, the organizing committee, had its ear to the ground from the very beginning of the insurrection and had a realistic idea of things to come. It planned the layout of the graves carefully, making ordered, efficient use of the available space. Everyone understood how important it was to bury martyrs' bodies in collective burial grounds and not leave them scattered in their thousands like bird feed up in the mountains or in the forests around the army camps and torture centers that had mushroomed across the valley. When the fighting began and the occupation tightened its grip, for ordinary people, the consolidation of their dead became in itself an act of defiance. Thank you.